Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be doing my year in books according to Goodreads. So if you want a chatty style video where we are going to talk about every single book of these 196 books that I read in 2024, this is the video for you. So come along and let's see what I read. First of all, to note, it is December 27th when I am filming this, and I have read 196 books. I may be able to squeeze in one, maybe two more books before the end of the year, but I think this is my final number. This is also a 100% completely blind reaction. I have not looked through all of these books, so I want to go through and see what I can remember from all of these books, if I can remember everything that I read, and I want to kind of give my thoughts on every single book that I read this year, including books that I did not review on my channel. So if you're curious about everything else that I don't talk about, then stay tuned. I am wearing a appropriate Mothman t-shirt that says Live, Laugh, Lurk, and we are going to be lurking through my books, and we're going to see what I've been reading. You may notice that I actually haven't been filming a lot lately. I have not read a lot in December. I've just been too busy with other things, and I don't currently have a good filming setup, so I'm going to try to figure something out. But 196 books for 2024, I'm calling that a win. I don't care if I haven't read very much in December. It is what it is. It says here 41,000 pages read. That is questionable, as we'll see, because sometimes I have to use placeholder records. We'll see. According to this, my shortest book was Trolls at 24 pages, and longest was The First Kingdom by Max Adams at 545 pages. I listened to The First Kingdom as an audiobook, so those pages read weren't really pages, but they count towards my total. Average book length was 211 pages. That sounds about right. I read some shorter ones. Most shelved was Atomic Habits by James Clear. I had already read that a couple times. I listened to the audiobook this time while running. It's an okay book. It's decent. I feel like it's self-explanatory. I'm getting off track. It's fine. 2 million shelved, so that doesn't surprise me. Least shelved was Driving the Scenic Route, Barnes of Michigan. That was a niche photography book. I was the only person who shelved it. That makes sense. Average rating 3.8. That doesn't surprise me, and that only doesn't surprise me because I know what I like to read, and I'm curious about a lot of stuff. So 3.8, that sounds about right. I would say my average read is somewhere between a 3.5 to 4 star read, so 3.8 sounds good. Highest rated, Leelanau Underwater. This was photography around underwater crashes in the Manitou Passage, I believe it was. It was super cool. The photography was gorgeous, beautiful. So the 5-star, perfect average. It was a less well-read book, because again, it's sort of niche, so it makes sense that it would only have a few ratings. And then, let's see, my first review of the year, role-playing. Okay, when we get into the books, I'll talk more. Role-playing was a massive disappointment for me. What did I say about this? I don't usually write reviews on Goodreads, only if I need to make a note. Had high hopes for this one, especially because I'm not a romance reader, but unfortunately, is that spelled correctly? Unfortunately, it fell flat 25% of the way in. Yeah, that's true. Only pushed through for book club. I read this for my book club, 1.5 stars. That's generous. The first 25%, I was totally sold on this book. I loved it. I loved that it was age gap. Sort of age gap. She was a little older than him, but I felt like everyone in this book had inappropriate boundaries and talked like they were in a medical textbook, and I didn't like it. So this one I had high hopes for, despite not being a romance reader, and romance disappointed me again, so yay. Okay, 2024 books. Let's go through. Again, this is totally blind. I have not refreshed. I do not know what's on here, so we're going to, and you, along with me, are going to be able to see every single book that I read in 2024 that I've recorded on Goodreads, but that should be everything. Starting off strong, Yokai Cats, volumes 2 and 3. This was just a manga series about cats with like yokai powers. Fun, simple, easy. Bill Bryson, The Lost Continent. I like Bill Bryson's humor, but I feel like it's, we'll say not always like really appropriate. I thought it was funny. This was Travels in Small Town America. I like this one. This one actually encouraged me to read A Walk in the Woods later in the year, which I thought was extra funny. A Ribbon of Highway by Taylor Rhodes. Oh, this was photography through Canada, so she did photography. I did think that something that could have been done better in this book is the photographs could have been placed in order like you were on a road trip through Canada, and it could have been a little longer, but working with what I got. So that one was decent. I finished the Haikyuu series. All these entries are in Japanese. I did not read it in Japanese. I read it in English. I don't speak, read, or understand Japanese. But I did finish this series. I love it. Haikyuu as a series inspired me to sign up for a volleyball rec league in where I live, and I have been having a blast with that as well. And I'm currently watching the anime. So this one is super fun. Finished the series. Very heartwarming. The Monocle Book of Home. So this one was just that Monocle magazine having a photography session with rich people's homes, basically. It's the right level of nosy for me for someone who rents an apartment, but it was super cool. It was cool to see homes in a wide variety of places. I did have some nitpicks, which you can see in my review. Something that that always gets me with these home photography sessions is none of the homes look lived in. And I understand that they don't look lived in because they have the home set up for a photography session, so they don't want to have like junk out on the counter. But no one's home actually looks that unlived in. It kind of misses that soul when there's not that lived in look. But we have 190 books to go through, so we're going to move on from the Monocle Book of Homes. It was cool to look through. More Haikyuu. Sea Monsters, this was just scratching that itch of my little 6th grade brain to look at dinosaurs. Same with Dragons down here. Lake Superior Secrets was photography around Lake Superior, one of the Great Lakes. Fukushima, or Return to Fukushima, this was a photography collection around Fukushima, which was the site of a nuclear disaster following a tsunami in 2011. This one inspired another book, which should be here somewhere, about Fukushima as well. Lighthouses of the Great Lakes. Lighthouses of the Great Lakes. It was kind of a nice, fun little read. Vampires, Field Guide to the Creatures That Stalk the Night. This was just kind of like a folklore introduction. This was really interesting. I liked this book. I distinctly remember reading this while I was at a bachelorette party. Not like when it was occurring. Like I was waiting for everyone to wake up and I read a ton at the party. Into the Wild. I had not read this one. This one was one I read for book club by Jon Krakauer. Very, very popular. If Atomic Habits wasn't on my list, I would imagine that Into the Wild would have been the most popular book that I had shelved this year. I liked the story despite not sympathizing with or having complicated thoughts about the protagonist, let's say, of the story. So I liked Jon Krakauer's retelling. However, I think Jon Krakauer was a little sympathetic. A little more sympathetic than I would have been. We'll just put it at that. I don't think I did a video review because I felt like my opinions might be a little controversial. But I did discuss this in depth with my book club. World Beyond Time, Sci-Fi Art of the 70s. This was a super cool book that looked at sci-fi, mostly covers of books from the 1970s. Oh, it was fantastic. Would make a great gift. We are a little bit past Christmas, but it was a really, really fun book that I think about a lot. And I have seen some of these covers in real life, and whenever I see a cover in real life that was mentioned in this sci-fi art of the 1970s, I get really excited. I'm like, I saw this in the sci-fi book. Okay, these entries are in Korean, but I did not read it in Korean. This is the Remarried Empress series, which I love. It is a woman who is going through the process. She's an empress, and she's in the process of getting a divorce from her husband. Her husband is initiating the divorce in lieu or in favor of the mistress, and the Remarried Empress is finding love for a second time. I'm enjoying the series. I believe it was originally like a webtoon comic. This is the Art of Japanese Prints. I love Japanese woodblock prints, so anytime I can get my hands on a book of that, it's cool. Fairies and Trolls, these were actually children's books, but they were kind of fun to look through. The art was super fun to look through. Again, this is kind of in that vein of like folklore, mythology. Terminal Peace. This is the final book in a series by Jim C. Hines. It's like the Galactic Janitors of the Post-Apocalypse, or is the series. Basically, it's one of those series where humans are very, very powerful instead of aliens being super, super powerful. However, they had this unfortunate accident, so they need to be tightly controlled. This is, again, book 3 of the series, but I do like Jim C. Hines, and this book inspired me to read more by him. We can see one down here, Goblin Quest. I read this one, also super funny. World Heritage Japan. This was a photography collection of World Heritage sites in Japan. Very interesting. Lacrimore. This was a book that was kind of horror-ish. It was a little freaky, a little scary. It's this house on an island and things are just weird about the house. There's a very unsettling feeling, but I don't particularly like horror or very gory horror, and there was none of that really. So this was the right level of spook without me being disgusted, and I thought it was fun. Bill Bryson, A Walk in the Woods. I thought this book was so funny. In this one, Bill Bryson walks on the Appalachian Trail, and I distinctly remember, I listened to this in audiobook, I distinctly remember them being, Bill was out with like his friend, they were hiking parts of it together. There was this like young teenage girl who was hiking with them who they just didn't like. I remember having to like suppress laughter because I was listening to it in the office when I was at work. Don't tell my manager that I was listening to an audiobook at work. But this one I thought was really funny. But again, I think Bill Bryson's humor is not for everyone. I think you can say that about most humorous books. Humor is very subjective. So what's humorous for one person isn't humorous for another, or someone else might find it offensive. But I thought it was funny. We see some more Remarried Empress. This is just volume 3 in the series. This is where things started to get interesting. So every year for Valentine's Day, I read romance books. And I just do that to get out of my comfort zone. I am not a romance reader, and I don't think it has necessarily anything to do with romance as a genre. I do find it usually very predictable, which I don't love. But also I have a lot of other nitpicks with the genre. Like usually it is not love, it is lust at first sight. It is not love at first sight. You are not in love with a man that you met 48 hours ago. You are in lust, which is fine, but just admit it. Also, there's usually a lot of convenient plot holes to get people alone in bedrooms together or in closets or behind drapes. The characters are usually very annoying. There's usually a miscommunication about 3/4 of the way through the book that has to be resolved, that if people just got their phones out or just talked to each other, we could resolve, and I hate when that happens. Romance, I want to like romance. Let me put it like that. I want to know why everyone has such a good time reading romance, but I really struggle. That being said, when there is a romance subplot in like a sci-fi book or a fantasy book, or when I get the right kind of romance that I feel like I'm invested in, I am 100% there, and it's going to be a 5-star read. I'm thinking, the hockey series, Check Please, like that was a comic series that for whatever reason that romance just worked for me. I'm trying to think. There's been some subplots in other sci-fi books that I remember that I loved the romance of, but usually romance on its own is not good for me personally. Kathy Yardley's role-playing was one I really wanted. It was 2 like nerdy adults who meet in an online game. She's a little bit older than him, I think, if I remember correctly, or I forget if they're both older or if there is an age gap. I said earlier there was an age gap. Anyways, they're both older. She has a kid. And the first 25%, I was completely invested. I was like, this is going to be so good. It's going to be nice to see actual adults and not like 21-year-olds running around being stupid. Instead, we can watch 40-something-year-olds run around and be stupid, but they also have like this little nerdy touch. It was so bad. The people in this book literally talked like they were reading medical diagnoses. There was one part where the man said that like the main male character was like, oh, I don't want to sleep with someone unless I have an emotional connection with them. And then the female main character went on for like what felt like 6 paragraphs of like medical diagnoses in a way that no one would actually talk. The woman actually also had a young son who was going off to college that I feel like she had super inappropriate boundaries with, where she would like say stuff that I feel like you shouldn't be talking with your teenage, like your teenage son does not need to know about your love life, even if you're a single adult, like a single parent. Like I feel like there are some lines that, especially when that kid is like in a very transitional period of life, they shouldn't hear about. And I feel like everyone in that relationship had inappropriate boundaries. And there was a lot I didn't like about this book. It just fell flat. I stopped caring about them. Everyone talked like they were in a textbook. Everyone felt like they were... no, I can't say that because I might get in trouble for saying that. Didn't like it. And I really wanted to. So, to compare, there's this book below called Naughty and Wild, which was 2 novellas in one. I thought this one was going to be bad. And it was bad. But I didn't have expectations. So, at the end of the day, the disappointment from the letdown of reading role-playing was worse than Laura Leigh's Naughty and Wild, because I knew Naughty and Wild was going to be horrendous, and it was. But role-playing I wanted to be good, and it wasn't. And that's what was disappointing. We'll get to Naughty and Wild, but I did read Flatland by Edwin A. Abbott. That is a classic. I loved it. It says a romance in many dimensions, but it's not romance. It's about math, but it's exploring life in a two-dimensional plane, and then a two-dimensional creature goes down to 1 dimension and up to 3 dimensions. This can be extrapolated out to think how us as 3-dimensional creatures may perceive a fourth or fifth or higher dimensions. Loved it. Fantastic. Jim C. Hines at Goblin Quest over here, but let's not go too far because next up we have Naughty and Wild by Laura Lee and J.C. Burton. Naughty and Wild was 2 novellas in one by this Laura Lee, one by this J.C. or Jackie Burton. I don't know how to say her name. We're going to say Lee and Burton. This one had 2 stories in it. The first one was about a woman who... There's like this man who's a banker, a finance guy. Again, sorry, I'm remembering this. I'm completely blind. This is everything based on my memory from something I read almost a year ago. He's like a banker or in charge of some important family, and there's this woman who's like the goddaughter of his father, and they're out to dinner. Not them. The man is out to dinner separately, and the woman is out to dinner doing something, and the man has a fiance, and then the goddaughter is like, "Oh, you're cheating on your fiance's cheating on you," and then they wind up, so he dumps the fiance, and then the goddaughter and him go back to his apartment, and then they hook up because he's had her eyes on her since she turned 18. Really? Since the moment she turned 18? Or, suspicious. But then, I don't know what happens. The man decides he needs to go live on this houseboat in Tennessee, so he's down there, like, thinking about how much he doesn't like life, and he has left the family business. But then, the goddaughter, who revealed everything, gets, like, attacked in her home, which there's only 4 named protagonists in the book, so it's pretty easy to figure out which of the 4, because there's 2 men and 2 women, and it was a man who attacked her. Because I think the fiance was cheating with the man's friend. So that was the 4th. So it was pretty easy to figure out who attacked her, but it was a mystery. And the only place the woman could go to be safe, the goddaughter could go to be safe, was his houseboat in Tennessee. Really? Really? That's the only place she can go to be safe? Nowhere else. Really? It was... Anyways, the rest of the time on the houseboat was just coming up with novel scenarios for them to have little to no clothes and be in some sort of compromising situation. I think there may have been a sniper at one point. It was bad. I don't recommend it. The second half of this one was a little better because there was the suggestion of plot. The first one was not romance, it was erotica, and I didn't know that. There was no plot. Like, what I just described was the entire plot, but it was somehow like 120 pages of just nothing. The second half actually had plot. It was a novella about a guy a federal agent who infiltrated a motorcycle gang to keep an eye on a politician's daughter who had also joined the motorcycle gang in order to keep tabs on her friend who had joined the motorcycle gang after dating someone. Didn't like it at all either, but at least I didn't have any expectations like role-playing, and there was a suggestion of a plot, so following the first book in this series, or in this book, it was much better. Naughty and Wild. No expectations. It was almost so bad it was good. You know what I mean? It was almost so bad that it was enjoyable to read, but it was pretty bad. Also, this man is supposed to be like the bad guy. He also looks very 2000s, and I think maybe this book didn't do it for me because I'm not interested in the bad boy type. Like, I'm not interested in a man who's riding a motorcycle trying to track down illicit substances across the Mexican border. I want a man who's going to remember to pick kids up from preschool and daycare. So this whole type... Also, why is he wearing a vest without any shirt underneath? Anyways, we'll leave that. Comey Can't Communicate, Volume 28, manga series I've been reading. Okay, 16 Ways to Defend a Walled City by K.J. Parker. I discovered K.J. Parker this year. He also writes under the name Tom Holt. That's his real name. K.J. Parker is what he writes fantasy under. Really enjoyed this one. Brenda Novak, When I Found You. This was something else I read for the romance Valentine's Day reads. I didn't like this one. This felt like escapism. This is what I call depressed suburban mom books. It felt like, imagine if you are, so the woman in this book had a kid, but then wound up getting divorced from her husband, so now she and her kid are moving across, and of course she runs into her one true love from way back in the day, and then there was this whole subplot about whether or not the kid was actually her husband's or his, because they had like hooked up when they were like on break from her husband right before they got back together and they got pregnant, and so the kid could be his, but turns out not to be his, but he's like helping her redo the house. I didn't like it. It just felt like escapism fantasy for depressed suburban moms whose marriages are falling apart. Which, you know what? If you're a depressed suburban mom whose marriage is falling apart, Brenda Novak might hit the spot, and that's okay. What doesn't work for me may work for you, and I am okay with the right audience finding that sort of book. So Brenda Novak, keep writing. She's making more money than I ever will in my life, and if you're a fan of her or her works appeal to you, then this is, again, my opinion, and I think it's great that there are books out there for everyone. My pancreas broke, but my life got better. This is a book discussing, it's autobiographical, but it is a manga / comic style about a woman who's going through pancreatitis for alcoholism. This author also wrote an autobiographical experience called My Lesbian Experience with Loneliness, I think is what she's best known for. And this is kind of the fallout of this book and some of the stress and how she started coping with that stress through alcohol. This book made me feel very sad, but it was a very important read. Leigh Brackett, The Blue Behemoth. So I read The Long Tomorrow by Leigh Brackett last year, 2023, and this is one of her short stories about like a traveling circus group or entertainment group. Short story, fun read. I feel like I could kind of see where this book was going in advance, but it was an enjoyable science fiction read. Monthly in the Garden with My Landlord, Volume 1. This was a manga series where this woman rents this house, but the landlord lives in. You can definitely see it's going towards a romance route. It was acceptable. It was fine. It felt a little predictable, and the library didn't have any further volumes, so I didn't continue reading it. Euler's Gem, The Polyhedron Formula and the Birth of Topology by David S. Richeson. This is one of the top books of the year, Euler's Gem. It discusses, again, the birth of topology, which most people are probably not familiar, but it's what we would consider rubber sheet geometry, where things can be bent or stretched and still retain what properties are they retaining when bent and stretched. So one of the classic examples is like a donut is the same thing or the same shape as a coffee cup, because you could deform a donut into a coffee cup without having to cut or glue any bits back together. It's a very fascinating field that most people don't experience because it's not exposed to people in high school, which is the extent of most people's math education. This was a fantastic book. If you took high school mathematics, you could read this book. And I thought it was a fantastic introduction. It actually kind of ruined another book that I was reading. Another book on this introduction to topology, was pretty good, but Euler's Gem was just better. This was another stab at Jim C. Hines. This was about the Goblin Queen. This was YA. It was acceptable. It was fine. It was just YA. And, well, YA, when reading it, I could see this could be enjoyable, but I wasn't the target audience, so. Vampire Forensics. This was some archaeology / history on vampires, or like vampire legends and what we could learn about it. It was entertaining. We have some more Remarried Empress. Fukushima. This was inspired by the Return to Fukushima book that I read, also with this Ichi F, A Worker's Guide, memoir of the Fukushima nuclear power plant. These two also tie into that photography collection that I read. This is about a worker who did the cleanup after the accident, so this was really interesting to read. And Fukushima, the story of a nuclear disaster, is just explaining what happened, but this one I think came much more from a US perspective, if I remember correctly, and I wish I had spent more time on the Japanese perspective because it happened in Japan. Remarried Empress, Volume 5. Paved Paradise, How Parking Explains the World. This was a really interesting book that explains how parking shapes the landscape of cities. I'm very interested in city design, so this book was interesting for that reason. It was an audiobook. Terry Pratchett, A Stroke of the Pen. So this book was actually a very interesting book. It was a collection of short stories that Terry Pratchett had written under another name that were rediscovered recently and put together. You can see some of the diamonds in the rough of some ideas that get maybe fleshed out later under Terry Pratchett. And it was fun to read some more stuff from him. It's quite a short, thin volume, but it was fun to read. Mysterious Patterns and Infinity. These were actually, this is about fractals and this is about infinity, obviously. These were kids' books. I wanted to see how they would explain mathematical concepts to little kids. Enjoyable. Murder at Haven's Rock by Kelly Armstrong. So this book was a murder mystery, and I had high hopes for this. I am most disappointed when a book doesn't pan out. So this book was about a couple who was building a secret hideaway town in northern Canada, and there's a group of contractors who are flown out, but then people start turning up dead, or there's bodies that show up. I didn't really like this book, to be honest. I felt like the two main characters were really annoying and really out of touch with reality the entire time. And I just could not suspend my disbelief to get past that. I felt like they acted as though the world owed them something, and they were very, very obnoxious. I did not care about their marriage. I did not care about their plans. I did not care about the village they were building, and I felt like those things should have been explained more, or the reader should have been made to care about those things more because they were central plot points. It does kind of follow, or it is a spin-off from another series, so perhaps my dislike of this book was because I didn't read the previous series. Arbitrary Lines, How Zoning Broke the American City and How to Fix It. This is, again, city planning. I need to go faster because we are not making good progress here. Monsters and Grotesques. This was a look at art in medieval manuscripts. You're going to see a lot of books about that. KJ Parker, we see him again with Prosperous Demon. This was another short, slim, fun read. I remember seeing this cover and being a little scared of it, but it was enjoyable. I feel like KJ Parker's books always end suddenly. Topology, this was a short introduction, but had been ruined by me reading Euler's Gem. Mathematics for Human Flourishing. This was a fascinating book that has reflections from a prisoner who is in the U.S. Justice system, but is teaching himself mathematics to a high level, and also is from this Francis Sue, who is a professor, if I remember correctly, who talks about how math can be intertwined for, like, basically how math is good for the soul. The Cancer Factory, Industrial Chemicals, Corporate Deception, and the Hidden Deaths of American Workers by Jim Morris. This was a cluster of bladder cancer caused by the chemical orthotoluidine. Basically, it feels very similar to another book I read about black lung called Soul Full of Coal Dust, in which both of these have a lot of parallels in which there are companies that know that a chemical they're exposing their worker to, or in the case of Soul Full of Coal Dust, a product or a substance that the workers are being exposed to is harmful to them. But they don't want to cut into their profits by doing anything about that, or they need someone to do the sort of work that the workers are doing, so they willingly allow their workers to suffer harm. Very sad to read, but not surprising, having read Soul Full of Coal Dust. Failure of Justice, a brutal murder, an obsessed cop, and 6 wrongful convictions by John Ferak. This book was, I think, like 600 pages, but was worth every single page in the book. There was a murder case that happened out in Nebraska. The town, it looks like Beatrice, but it's not pronounced that way, so I don't remember how you were supposed to pronounce it. But there was a woman who was murdered, and there were 6 individuals who the obsessed cop forced convictions out of. I believe some of the individuals may have been have had intellectual disabilities, if I remember correctly. Basically, the whole book discussed how these wrongful convictions were obtained, and these people spent a good portion of their life behind bars until DNA evidence cleared them, and an original suspect who had been overlooked was determined to be the real culprit. And the whole book was it was tough to read, but it was very interesting to see how these wrongful convictions or these wrongful confessions or forced confessions could be incorrect, and just how the breakdown of the justice system can occur when someone has a preconceived notion of who did the crime. Very, very interesting. Dinosaur art. On a little bit more happy note, dinosaur art, we're indulging my inner child. Shinhanga, this was an art movement in Japan following that ukiyo-e art style, the Japanese woodblock prints. Love it. I have since traveled to places in the U.S. to see some of these prints in art museums, so Shinhanga. Faces of Power and Piety. This is another book on medieval manuscript art. Maths, 100 Ideas in 100 Words. This was again, introduction to mathematics, 100 ideas. It was fun. The Clinic by Kate Quinn. This book follows a woman who's attempting to figure out what happened to her sister, and so in order to do so, she checks herself into a high-end rehab clinic where things are not always as they seem. It was entertaining. It looked like a very thick book, but it read very, very quickly. A very short introduction to linguistics is exactly as it seems. This was interesting. Kind of kicked me off on a linguistics kick this year. Trolls, another folklore mythology book. This was me switching from KJ Parker to Tom Holt. Tom Holt is his real name. Management Style of the Supreme Beings. I thought this was a funny book. Basically, the story is the Supreme Beings, which are a stand-in for God, decide to sell out to a management company. I thought the premise was pretty funny. I feel like the ending of all of his books are always a little weird, but the humor style was right up my alley. Magic and Medieval Manuscripts, another book on medieval art. Off to Be the Wizard by Scott Meyer. This book is based on the premise that a man discovers a computer program in which you can alter reality by altering the computer program, and he has these wizard-like powers, but he gets sucked back into medieval times due to getting in trouble in modern day, where he discovers other people have also discovered this power, and they act as wizards in the medieval world. But there is maybe someone doing nefarious things in their midst. This book was entertaining because the concept was entertaining. I think people might not like this book because it was kind of slow to start with. And I think the most interesting thing in this book happened in like the last 10 pages and setting up for book 2. Indiana Barnes, photography collection of Indiana Barnes. Medieval Cats, a collection of art about medieval cats. The Dispatcher by John Scalzi. This was a sci-fi book. In the future, people who are killed come back, which makes things very, very difficult. If you die naturally, you're fine. So the dispatcher is an individual who works at like hospitals. So when a patient is dying, the dispatcher comes in and kills them, and then they are brought back to life several hours. It's like several hours back. So if you were in a traumatic accident and are dying out, like bleeding out, you can be killed and then brought into your state a couple hours before the accident. So it's an interesting thought experiment. The story's fine, but I think the thought experiment behind it is more interesting. I think I added the audiobook, but I read this. Shinhanga, another Shinhanga book. This one was really good. Okay, my number is off, but I'm not gonna sweat it because I'm sure I've missed a book or two this year. This book, Assyria, the Rise and Fall of the World's First Empire, I read about half of it and the library wanted it back. So I guess it can stay on my list. It's not truly finished. But as I said, I'm sure I've forgotten another book or two. I know there have been audiobooks that I have forgotten to add, so I'm not going to sweat leaving that one on or correcting it. 4,000 Weeks, Time Management for Mortals by Oliver Burkeman. I mean, this book is kind of self-explanatory. I feel like most people should understand that they are indeed mortal. I think having a number, 4,000 weeks, feels very, concrete. I've also seen people have these little memento moris, am I saying that correctly, where they mark off a week every time a week is done, and seeing if you live to 90, how many weeks you truly have is kind of a sobering thought, and then think how much of that is spent scrolling on your phone is another sobering thought. But I do think Oliver Burkeman was a little bit more pessimistic than I would personally like. I feel like the book was maybe written for people who were a little bit of a workaholic as well, had problems separating work life and personal life. So for that reason, I'm not sure I liked the book, but I think the idea was good. Land Art, this is a cool photography nature book. The Sunset Years of Agnes Sharp, a murder mystery. This one was translated from German, if I remember correctly. It's about some older individuals who are living together in a home, and they're attempting to solve a murder mystery while also trying to cover up maybe the true purpose of their home because they have some things and ideas that they're doing. Legends of the Nahanni Valley. This is a collection of legends, stories, and myths from northern Canada. Super fascinating. Pluses and minuses, how math solves our problems. I love math books, so we have another book on math. Lanny by Max Porter. This was a vaguely disturbing book about a young boy who goes missing and the fallout in the local community. A little disturbing, not gonna lie. 5 Minute Linguist. This was catapulted because I read the other linguist book. Trail of the Lost. This is about a woman searching to find people who have gone missing on the Pacific Crest Trail. A little bit sad, a little bit upsetting. Listen to it as an audiobook when running. The Two-Parent Privilege. This book, I went in... How do I say this? I went in not sure how this was going to be approached. I do have a two-parent household. I did grow up with both my parents, who are still married, who are still together. And I think Melissa Kearney did a good job not shaming people who wind up in situations also doing a good job explaining that there are times in which having a one-parent household is better than doing something like enduring abuse. And I think she did a really good job sticking with economic facts in the way that it could spill over. Some people didn't like her sticking to economic facts, but this is such a hot topic, a hot button issue that I think sticking to the numbers and the science was the way to go. This was enjoyable. I listened to it in one audiobook go. And I think she did as good a job as possible explaining that there are significant benefits that are conferred, not just when parents are together, but when they are married and acting as like an economic unit. Children truly benefit. And I think she handled this topic with as much sensitivity and as well as she could, while recognizing that there are people who will wind up in the less ideal situation, and as a society we should also aim to ensure those people have the correct support in place to succeed. Those children should not fall behind. This was a controversial book, I could tell, so I did not review it. Kaiju Preservation Society by John Scalzi. Another John Scalzi. This is about a fun futuristic or alternate world sort of environment. People pointed out in my book reviews that the gender of the main character is apparently never mentioned in the book, and I assumed it was a woman, if I remember correctly. But it was a fun read. Slow Productivity by Cal Newport. Interesting book. Cal Newport is on thin ice for me, because his first book was like deep work, and I listened to that book, and I think maybe he didn't realize how he could accomplish how much deep work had a lot to do with how much of the unimportant stuff his wife was managing in the household. That's what I'll say about that. I think Cal Newport's ideas are good. I think he needed some more well-rounded perspectives. Slow Productivity was fine, though. Night Wings by Robert Silverberg. This was part of me reading through the Hugo Award winners and finalists. A Medieval Book of Beasts. This was a bestiary. It was really interesting to read. Inkblot. This was just a fun comic. It had a cute little black cat. A Boy and His Dog. Harlan Ellison. Harlan Ellison was an individual. I read his Wikipedia article and his Wikipedia entry. That man was something else. A Boy and His Dog was also something else. I feel like it had strong overtones of like Fallout. The character in the book is definitely not a good character. And when I first read the book, I didn't really like it. I didn't really love it. But having read a lot of other stuff this year, I think I respect Harlan Ellison's willingness and ability to write a main character who is not a good person, but is still the main character. Because I feel like that's something that a lot of authors shy away from. The main character in nowadays, this is a generalization, but I find that a lot of fiction nowadays, the main character either has to be a good person who's fighting bad, or the main character, if they do mess up, has to have a secondary character in the book give a moralizing speech to the main character explaining how the main character was bad, in which case the main character then learns from their mistake and apologizes. Which, there's nothing wrong with any of that, but I appreciate, and I guess I think most readers should reach a point of maturity where they recognize that the character that they're reading might not be a good person, or might do things that are morally gray or morally just not correct. And that doesn't mean the author is espousing those ideas, but that it is what the character is doing in the book. And I find that sometimes that breakdown occurs. That being said, Harlan Ellison did seem like a character. 3 for Tomorrow, I just use this as a placeholder. I only read, I think it was We All Die Naked by James Blish. That one had a very good, I feel like the atmosphere of that novella was really well set. I like that one. Town of Evening Calm, Country of Cherry Blossoms. Fumio Kunio, I've also read her In This Corner of the World, I think it was called. Yeah. That was last year, though. She writes about post-World War II Japan and the impact the war had on civilians, because in a war there are many non-combatants who usually pay a very heavy price for decisions that they really didn't have much say in. Witchcraft, A History in 13 Trials by Marian Gibson. This is exactly what it says. It was relatively interesting. There were a couple stories that still stand out, including the one woman who was like a medium spiritualist during World War II in England. She was one of the last people tried under the Witchcraft Act. I think about her a lot, actually. I was bringing her up in conversation like 2 weeks ago, so this was a really interesting book. Isaac's Storm. This was a story about a hurricane that occurred in Texas and how it really altered the landscape in the United States, or like power centers, and this was everything that led up to it. There was a meteorologist who was in charge in the area who experienced this storm. I listened to this in audiobook. It was relatively interesting. It was more interesting than I thought it was going to be. I was listening to this at the office again because we just had like a boring stretch of time. So I listened to this. And it was better than I thought it was going to be, to be honest. My takeaway from this book is the United States didn't want to listen to meteorologists in Cuba because they were Cuban. And if they had, things could have been a lot different. Next one, Illustrating Mathematics. This was exactly as it seems. It was a collection of students, actually, who had some sort of summer grant, I think it was, to illustrate mathematical problems. The mathematical problems illustrated were sometimes quite complex. This wasn't a very simple mathematic book, but the art was really interesting. And the art really helped me understand the problems being illustrated, so I appreciated it. Hakusai's Mount Fuji. This is another woodblock print book. Beasts, Factual and Fantastic, Medieval Art. The Gods Lie. This was a standalone manga, which I was really wanting to get more into. I had just finished Haikyuu for the year. I'm currently reading Komi Can't Communicate, which is an ongoing series, and sometimes just reading a standalone manga is just refreshing. Hyperborea, this is photography from like northern Russia, like the Siberian region. Very cool. I gave it a 5 star. Astrology and Medieval Manuscript, more medieval art. Random Acts of Medicine. This was, as the sub-thing says, the hidden forces that sway doctors, impact patients, and shape our health. Really, really interesting. I listened to that in audiobook. Emerge. This was just a book on creativity. The Saugatuck Dunes. This was a lot of painting, primarily paintings, but different art celebrating these dunes that are on Lake Michigan. Backroads of the Midwest. Photography collection detailing backroads of the Midwest. I think this book was super cool. Forbidden Rites, A Necromancer's Manual of the 15th Century by Richard Kiekhaefer. This was a book about how necromancy was kind of used in the Middle Ages, or how it was thought of. It was academic but interesting. Komi, Volume 29. Again, did not read it in Japanese. Patient Zero. This was another book that I was inspired to read, having read Random Acts of Medicine. Just about the maybe like the first person who did something, or the Patient Zero, or origins. It was entertaining enough. I read both Random Acts of Medicine and Patient Zero while on road trips. Really fun, I know. Lee Bardugo, The Familiar. This was like a sci-fi, no, not sci-fi. This was like a fantasy book. I thought it was entertaining enough. It takes place in like Spain during the Inquisition. Simon Hill, The Proof is in the Plants. So I am vegetarian. I have been my entire life. Essentially, I don't like the taste of meat. So I just was reading this to get more ideas about how to maybe combine what I do eat to have better health, I guess. It was entertaining. It was just kind of like educational. I think I listened to this in audiobook format. I'm pretty sure I did. The Factory. This was a book about a woman who gets a job at a local factory where things are just a little off, a little odd. It is a little unsettling, maybe a little weird, but I did enjoy it. It is a thin book. The Unstrung Harp, or Mr. Earbrass Writes a Novel. I am not sure how to explain or describe this book other than you just have to read it yourself. It was written in like the 1950s, if I remember correctly, by Edward Gorey, and it's almost a self-referential book about a man writing a book. So it's a book about a man who wrote a book about a man writing a book. But it's somehow very enjoyable and fun, and I want to say under 50 pages. I had a great time. Art and Fear, observations on the perils and rewards of art making. This was enjoyable essay. It's referenced, I find, in a lot of other books. So, yeah, I'm glad I got around to finally reading it. Why We Sleep, Unlocking the Power of Sleep and Dreams by Matt Walker. I listened to Matt Walker talk on a podcast, and I thought it was enjoyable, so I read his book. City, volumes 1, 2, 3, and 4. I got back into the series, so 2 of these are a reread, 2 of these are new. Volume 5, there's like one library in my state that has Volume 5, and it's permanently on loan, it feels like, so I've again gotten stuck with the series. But I do love it. It's Kiichi Aroe, who also did the Nichijou series, so it was fun. Scribes and Illuminators, Medieval Craftsmen. So I got into this Medieval Craftsmen series where there's a under 100-page book that discusses a specific medieval craft, who did it, the guilds, how it was set up, and how it was practiced throughout Europe. So you'll see a lot of these. A Letter to the Luminous Deep by Sylvie Cathrall. This is a book that takes place on a ocean world. It's kind of academic in nature. It starts as a pen pal. There's 2 sets of pen pals in the book. One of them is like a couple years after the other one, where the first set of pen pals went missing. I thought it was fantastic. I was actually sucked in. This was a good book for me. Inanna, Lady of the Largest Heart. This is poetry from one of the first, or some of the first recorded poetry in human history, celebrating a goddess from Mesopotamia. It was enjoyable to read. See You Tomorrow at the Food Court. This was another standalone. I was in my standalone phase about 2 friends who meet at the food court. It was fun. Correspondence from the End of the Universe. This is a manga series about a boy who's, or not boy, I say boy because he's like college age if I remember correctly, or he had just graduated college, which feels young to me, but he's an adult man, who gets his name drawn because apparently the universe is run through bureaucracy, kind of like Management Style of Supreme Beings, but in manga format. And he has to go serve some time helping manage the universe, and he gets separated from the individual he loves, and he's stuck here, but he's learning all about the universe, so it's fun. Building the Medieval World, more about medieval art. Ennead. This series, so I didn't really know what I was getting into. This series, I read volumes 1 and 2 this year, and it is ancient Egyptian. I didn't realize there's also romance. It is, which isn't necessarily a problem, but I think after volume 2, the series gets a lot more explicit. I think there may be a watered down version. No library I can find has more than volume 2, so I think things get a little spicy at volume 3. I think the premise was interesting. It is the Egyptian pantheon and them struggling for power and dominance. And having read other books, like another comic series called Pantheon, or not comic series, but another comic book called Pantheon, the Egyptian mythology was spicy to begin with, so probably accurate. Entertaining. I would like to find the watered down version of volume 3 somewhere, because I don't think I need everything super explicit, and the libraries are not going to purchase that, so I would like to read volume 3. We see 2 more of the Medieval Craftsmen series, Embroiderers and Glass Painters, Saints and Medieval Manuscript, more art, another volume in Correspondence from the End of the Universe, Comey volume 30, another volume in Correspondence from the End of the Universe, Tusks of Extinction, which is a quick sci-fi read where they take the mind of a scientist and put it in a woolly mammoth. It's very interesting. I would recommend reading it, mostly for the concept. The Middle Ages, A Graphic History, very enjoyable. I liked the easy, accessible interest, or way if you're interested in the Middle Ages to get to know the Middle Ages. I liked it. I thought it was good. I kind of got kicked off on a Middle Ages kick here. Anne McCaffrey, The Ship Who Sang. This was for my Hugo Award series. The cover looks very dated in my opinion, but the story is really good. We have volume 2 of the Ennead here. This was the last one I could read before the libraries got wised up to, I guess, how spicy this series was going to be and stopped purchasing them. I thought it was fun, though. The Anxious Generation, The Great Rewriting of Childhood is Causing an Epidemic of Mental Illness by Jonathan Haidt. I actually liked this book. I know it's controversial. So I didn't review it. I don't think I did a review on that one. Seasons of Sleeping Bear. This was photography from Sleeping Bear Dunes, which is a nationally protected area in the United States. It was great. Driving the Scenic Route, Barns of Michigan. This was, again, people photographing barns in Michigan, similar to that person who photographed barns in Indiana, but a different person. Flowers for the Sea. This was a fantasy book about individuals who are stuck on a boat, and there's this woman who's on the boat with them who they do not like. Seems to be some sort of divide between her and the other people on the boat. However, she has the only live pregnancy, and the whole world has been flooded, so they need this pregnancy to survive. It definitely has some body horror elements, and I did not like this book. This book I do not currently have children, and this book horrified me, even though I know that stuff like this does not happen when you have children. There's not like tentacle things, but I did not like it at all. Range, Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World by David Epstein. I think this was really interesting. I think there's some tie-in here that I haven't fully explored. So I went to a liberal arts college, and I think having exposure to a range of information has a lot of benefits, but I'm not entirely sure how to verbalize that. This book started to come close to that, and I thought it was a good book. It was an audiobook. The Power of Now. So this book, I want to start by saying I do not take every single word in this book as gospel truth, but I think there are a lot of parts of this book that are very, very, very applicable and that I really enjoy and I do practice, I would say. So I would say the key of this book is like mindfulness. It's a 5-star read. I listen to the audiobook about once every couple years, and I find this very, very, very useful. So I love it. I actually picked up a personal copy. Correspondence from the End of the Universe. Another entry in the series, another entry in the Medieval Craftsman series, English Tylers. What the Dead Know by Barbara Butcher. I listened to this on audio book. This is a woman who was a death investigator in New York City. Very, very fascinating career. I could not do it. Michigan's Upper Peninsula, Spirit of the Place. This is a photography collection. The Bayou Tapestry, a comic strip where this individual takes the tapestry, which describes the Battle of Hastings, 1066, and does it in a comic style, which is almost the style that it exists in the tapestry. It was fun. This is Assyrian Prophecies. This was rather academic, but an enjoyable read. Another entry in the Medieval Craftsman series, Painters, Volume 6 of the Remarried Empress. Magic in Merlin's Realm, History of Occult Politics in Britain. This was fascinating. I love this book. This was everything that I wanted in a book. I listened to this in audiobook, if I remember correctly. The First Kingdom, Britain in the Age of Arthur. So there is this period after Rome pulls out of Britain and before 1066 that is kind of a dark era in terms of what we know about Britain, and Max Adams attempts to explore it. I would say it leans a little bit academic, maybe a little dry. I did listen to it in audiobook, but I think it was very important and it filled in a lot of gaps. High Times in the Low Parliament. I wanted to like this book by Kelly Robson, but I just didn't. It just didn't have the spark that made it fly. I don't know why I said fly. That makes a book go. I don't know. I wasn't feeling this book. It was short, so I finished it, but I don't know. Not my cup of tea. I couldn't tell if everyone in this book was women too. I think I was like 3/4 of the way through the book, and I was like, I don't think they've mentioned a man, and I don't know if that's intentional or not. So that was that. The Ancient Near East, a very short introduction. Another one of these very short introductions. Ethelred the Unready. This is a biography of a king. The Battle of Hastings, Fall of the Anglo-Saxons and Rise of the Normans by Jim Bradbury. This is military history, which I don't normally love, but this was actually really good for military history for me. Medieval Horizons, Why the Middle Ages Matter by Ian Mortimer. This was an enjoyable read. Atomic Habits. I listened to this on audiobook while running. I feel like a lot of Atomic Habits is, in my personal opinion, common sense, and that is just me. However, I do have my flaws, but one of them is not self-discipline. I tend to be very good at setting goals. I'm very disciplined. I'm definitely type A. I keep a paper planner. I have a habit tracker, and I am a big believer in doing something small every single day can get you very, very far. But it's good to listen to, and it was something to listen to while I ran. Because once you start adding miles to running, okay, so I run because I want to be able to play sports. That's why. I don't actually enjoy running in and of itself. I like the way I feel after I run, but I don't like running, and I only run because I want to play sports. So I have to force myself to run, and then I always want to stop early, so I listen to audiobooks, which kind of gets me through. That's where this comes from. So I have a lot of audiobooks that I listen to when running, so I can run the 4, 5, 6 miles that I need to run and not quit early, because I'll be listening to something like this. Botanical Curses and Poisons. This was a book that was kind of just a collection of stories and folklore around different plants that might kill you, or stories that were associated with plants. I listened to it in audiobook format. I wish I had read it because I think there was a lot of illustrations I missed. Notre Dame by Ken Follett. This was a short history of cathedrals. It was enjoyable, but it was very, very short. Medieval Craftsmen. We have 2 more here, 1 Armorers, 1 Masons and Sculptors. Transformation of Magic. This is Magic, another book that kind of deals more academically with how magic was thought of in the Middle Ages. Stegosaurus, I'm indulging my inner child. Cat plus Gamer, Volume 3, just another series I'm reading. Covenant, Volume 1. This is about if priests had like magic powers, and there's people who are fighting. And the priests are also like kind of hot, ostensibly. I actually really liked it. I was kind of vibing with the whole thing, not gonna lie. But I think there's only Volume 1 in any library that I have access to, so they're just priests who fight things. It's loosely based off the Catholic Church, but it's alternate universe. It's a different sort of church, and there is some sort of schism that they're heading towards or going towards, and there are questions about the source of power. And there's definitely a higher authority which does not approve of these priests. I think it's a romance. I think 2 of the priests are gonna have a romance. I think. That's what I suspect. And there's also some mystery stuff going on. I really liked this one, but I need to get Volume 2. Mouse Guard. This was a fun little world where the mice are little people. I read Fall. This was a reread, and I read Winter. Worlds of the Medieval Knight. This reminds me of those DK books that I would read as a kid, like the DK Knight books, but for adults. Love Triangle. The moral of the story is everything's always triangles. A Short History of the World According to Sheep. This was a recommendation from the librarians. So shout out to the librarians at my library who don't know I exist or this channel exists. But I listened to this. It became a short history of the world according to Wool, but that's fine. Ghost Stations by S.A. Barnes. This was a fun introduction. This is a world in which people go to this planet. There's a station on the planet. It's sci-fi. It's set in the future. And things appear to have gone wrong at the station. It was the right amount of spooky without being really gory, so I did like it. Leelanau Underwater. Exploring shipwrecks in Leelanau County in the Manitou Passage. This is in Lake Michigan. Enjoyable. Alaska. This was a super cool photography collection. There's a couple photographs that are just imprinted in my memory, including one of the tundra plants up close. Super fun. I feel like I looked through this 3 times before I got it back to the library. The Secret Lives of Numbers, a hidden history of math's unsung trailblazers. This was a super fun book that kind of looks at the people who discovered things in math that maybe aren't credited or didn't fully get all the way there, or how do I say that? It's like when people discovered something, but they weren't the ones to write it in the clear format, or they weren't the ones to make all the connections, so they don't get the credit for it. But they made a lot of interesting connections that maybe happened earlier than we thought. So that book was interesting. It's like math history. Views from the Sleeping Bear, photography collection of Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore, inspired by the other one I read. Super cool. Ray Bradbury, The Homecoming. This is a short story by Ray Bradbury of Fahrenheit 451 fame. I like this one. It's a boy who lives in a family of like vampires, zombies, but he is not immortal like them, so he will die. It's not quite as sad as I just made it sound. How to Slay a Dragon, a fantasy guide to the real Middle Ages. This was a book written for teens. I feel like it's designed to get kids interested in history. It was alright. Medieval Craftsmen, Goldsmiths, a very short introduction to mathematics. This book was actually terrible. I listened to this on audiobook, which I would not recommend, because there was a lot of visual cues, but the visual cues did not mess me up. I only say that because I do have my degree in math, and I was very familiar with the concepts being presented, and I knew exactly what illustrations he was using. Most people should not do that unless you are very, very familiar with the topic. I don't know who this book was for. It was too complicated for a beginner, but it was not advanced enough to hold any interest with anyone who has an advanced knowledge, and it was written in a the story didn't flow. This was not a good book. Whatever book you read, don't read this one. Who's Raising the Kids? Big Tech, Big Business, and the Lives of Children by Susan Lin. This is a book that discusses maybe some of the problems with advertising to children and turning children into little consumers. There were sections of the book I disagreed hard with, and there were sections of the book that I really loved. So this was a very polarizing book, and also kind of like The Anxious Generation. I did not review because I felt like it might be controversial. And also, with both of those books, I personally don't have kids of my own, so I feel like, what business do I have telling other people how to raise their kids if I don't have any kids of my own. So 10 Arguments for Deleting Your Social Media Account right now by Jaron Lanier. Social media, I think, is kind of maybe not great, especially the quantity in which we consume it in. This was an interesting book. Christopher Moore, Practical Demon Keeping. I listened to this audiobook. Christopher Moore, I really enjoy, but his humor style is not for everyone. I liked Practical Demon Keeping. I thought this one was really funny. I really did. I listened to that audiobook while I was doing a lot of fall hiking in the Midwest, so I like very deeply associate this with like back country roads in the fall. Fantastic. The Anglo-Saxon Age, a very short introduction. Yeah, this one was a very short introduction to the Anglo-Saxon Age. Ethelstan, another biography of a king of England. Al-Kindi, the father of Arab philosophy. This was an enjoyable introduction to an individual I did not know much about. Weird Medieval Guys is a collection of medieval art and medieval trivia, I guess you could say. The Tale of the Tailor and the Three Dead Kings by Dan Jones is a retelling of a ghost story from, I think, the 13th century. It is a medieval ghost story that gets retold by Dan Jones. It's quite short, but I enjoyed it. Millions, Billions, Zillions. This inspired me to read another book that I read just like a couple days ago. When confronted with large numbers, many people just kind of zone out and aren't really sure what they're hearing, and this book kind of breaks some of the stuff down for you so you understand what you're seeing. I thought it was good. Edward the Confessor. This was the king whose lack of an heir set up a succession crisis which led to the Battle of Hastings in 1066. So I read his biography. Another Comey Volume 31. Brief Lessons in Creativity. Trying to stretch my brain. I feel like I'm not a creative person, so I felt like this could be a good book to get me out of my comfort zone. The Epic of Gilgamesh. This was a comic retelling of one of the oldest stories. I thought it was enjoyable and a really good way to do it. This book also, though, is not... Well, it could be for children. I would recommend glancing through it before you give it to your child. Ill Met in Lankhmar. This is actually a novella for my Hugo reading project. I really liked it. I thought it was really fun. I think it was by Fritz Leiber. Yeah. Great Minds of the Medieval World. This is a great course that I listened to, audiobook. I thought it was really good, and a really good overview. Terry Jones, Medieval Lives, an overview of different people in the medieval world and the lives they lived. Al-Biruni, who was another Arab philosopher. Neo-Retro Illustrations, which is this digital art. The book is entirely in Japanese, but I just enjoyed the art. And the final two books of the year. How to Lie with Statistics by Daryl Huff. This book was written in the 1950s, I want to say, so some bits of this book are quite dated, I will say, but the essence is really important. It's about how statistics don't have to be outright lies to manipulate you in a certain sense. I thought it was an enjoyable and good read. And the final book, which I actually finished this afternoon, is Tress of the Emerald Sea by Brandon Sanderson. My book club is going to be discussing it, so I had to read it. I loved it. I probably won't review that one just because there's so many other people with larger followings who will do such a better job reviewing the book than I would, so I will just leave that to them. And that is all the books that I read in 2024. My last review of the year, I just mentioned that this was going to be a placeholder. So that is what I read in 2024. That is 196 books. So I want to hear what you read. I'm really surprised. I remembered every single book. There was no book that I was like, I don't remember anything about this book, or I definitely don't remember reading that this year. So I could remember all of those books that I read and how I felt about them. I want to hear about your year, what you read, what you liked, how many you read. Do you remember them? Did you have any horrible ones? Do you have any thoughts or comments on what I read? Please let me know in the comment section down below. Thank you for sitting through this entire book chat, book overview. Thank you for sticking around, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.